the tech talk of changing security cultures in African context. We're talking about finding from KnowBefore's Africa Cybersecurity Culture Research Report, Defining Security Culture, Best Practices to Build Security Cultures and Awareness Programs. For this Tech Talk, we have with us Anna Collard, SVP of Content Strategy and Evangelist, KnowBefore Africa, South Africa. Anna is an experienced creative security awareness content developer and founder with a demonstrated history of working in the cybersecurity industry. Anna has successfully grown her business from bootstrapped startup to US acquisition and a scaling team in hyper-growth environment under new ownership. Thank you so much, Anna, for joining us today, and over to you.
Thanks so much for the introduction. Let me quickly share my screen with you. Good morning, everyone, or it's probably already a bit later on your side. Thank you so much for taking the time and listening to my talk. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to jump right over that because you've done a pretty decent introduction. So the next, I think I have 15 minutes. I will talk about how we define security culture. Also some of the findings from a culture research paper that we publish once a year. And in fact, the latest one has just been released a week ago, so it's brand new data. And then if time allows, I'll also jump into a few tips on how we can effectively change security culture or improve it. So Forrester have done a survey across about 1,100 security professionals across the world. And what was quite interesting is that nearly everyone participating said that having a positive security culture has a positive impact on the overall business success. So it's no longer just be considered, a compliance box or something that we have to do to prevent risk, but having a sound security culture has like a positive impact on things like brand reputation, things like consumer or customer trust. So security culture is a really a way more strategic objective of businesses nowadays than it probably was a few years ago. But then in the same research, what was interesting is that when asked, how do you define security culture, a lot of the participants gave completely different answers. So out of 1,100 questions, there were 759 different unique definitions on how or what security culture really means. And roughly those could be categorized into compliance and policy, as well as the awareness level of the people in the organization, as well as how well is security embedded overall. So there's amongst us, like the security professionals, there is not a uniform understanding of what security culture really is. And this is quite interesting because it shows that there is still an immaturity in terms of how do we actually, if we can't define it, how do we even measure it, right? So if we look at, how sociologists define culture per se, or organizational culture, so they talk about the ideas, the customs, and the social behaviors of people within a group. So it's not about how we behave at home or when we are by ourselves, but really how we behave within the context of an organizational group or, multiple people in a social setting together. The ideas refer to things that we believe in, and customs are our behaviors or day-to-day activities. And if we apply that to security, then we can say, well, security culture is anything referring to our ideas, customs, behaviors that influence the security of the organization. But that in itself, again, is something that is quite sort of, it is scientific, but it's, again, difficult to define or measure. So what a company called Culture, by the way, from Norway, what they have done is they've really taken a scientific approach to measuring security culture by using dimensions that have been measured in science for over the last 30 years. So things like attitude, cognition, which refers to how much do we understand about a topic, norms, which refers to the unwritten rules, or things that people do, even though it's not in a policy or anyway. So those are all dimensions that can be academically measured. And sort of, if they refer to security, we now have a way of digging deeper into what makes up an organizational security culture, and how do we score in each of those dimensions, and then over time, how do we improve in each of those areas. So as I mentioned, attitudes refers to, how do people, when you talk to end users, like what is their attitude towards security? It could be positive, it could be negative. Cognition, as I mentioned, is how much do people understand about security principles. Communication refers to how much does the organization communicate security principles, how well is that communicated, how much do people talk to each other about security. Compliance refers to the written rules, the policies, standards, procedures that are in place. Norms are unwritten rules, like what do people do even though it's not written anyway. And responsibilities refers to how much do people individually take accountability for the security. And all of those can be, through survey techniques, can be measured. And that, we can't really manage unless we measure something, right? So that is, it's a great way to identify how mature or immature an organization is. And as I mentioned, so once a year, so Culture was acquired by KnowBe4, and once a year they publish a report that sort of provides an insight into the security cultures across all of their customers and KnowBe4's customers. And now we're having a data set of over 120,000 participants across 24 countries. And I think, if you look at the data, it's quite, well, it's not really surprising that the banking or the financial services industry across the globe are scoring the best. And then there's a relatively big gap between the higher performers and the lowest performers. And I think what is a little bit surprising and very concerning, especially, is that the lowest performers are the education sector, as well as sort of energy, utilities, transportation, all of that referring to critical infrastructure. So what was also very interesting is when we looked at, in terms of the lowest scores within the dimensions, and we look at norms, meaning the unwritten rules, how do people behave, the legal professions and the education sector scored the worst. In terms of the attitude, like are they open about security principles? Again, like the education sector scored the worst, but also closely followed by the government construction sectors. So there's like a lack of understanding and a negative attitude towards security within those sectors. And then again, very surprising actually, if we consider that the education sector is where we would like people to be made aware from, like from the school level all the way up to universities, to teach youngsters about the threats and the risks in terms of cybercrime. And there is a real lack in terms of the cognition and the actual learning around security principles. So that is something that from an African point of view as well, we really need to be aware of and do more about, because considering, that we have like 500 million of people coming online in the next 2 years, and a lot of them will be youngsters using their mobile devices, and if they haven't been exposed to any sort of training, and the education sector is not doing much about it, nor the government, that's concerning. In terms of the overall, like if we compare Africa to the rest of the world, we actually don't fare too badly. We are on par with America, and even ahead of the Europeans. What is quite interesting there is, I think that the results may be slightly skewed, because the majority of the African respondents were from the financial services sector in South Africa. And the people there may be very much, from an attitude point of view, have a more positive attitude towards security, because South Africans are very much security conscious in their day-to-day lives, and the financial services sector, as we've seen before, are ahead of the curve. So it will be interesting to see how that comparison changes within the next release next year. What is also interesting, if we dive in deep into, comparing Africa to the Americans, for example, then we can see that Africans are scoring way better in terms of attitudes and behavior when it comes to security, but we are slightly behind when it comes to compliance and communication. So that could talk to that the fact that the American organizations are a step ahead in terms of communicating and sort of documenting the rules and the policies, but the Africans have a slightly better attitude or behaving actually slightly better than the Americans. So why, I mentioned this, it's a ticking time bomb in Africa where we have so many people coming online. A lot of them will be first-time users, so they haven't been exposed to any form of security awareness training, using their mobile phones. And then on the flip side, we have, like a cybercrime that is shifting the attention towards the emerging economies. Africa is definitely highly attractive. And there's also, we're seeing an increase in mobile malware and the sophistication of social engineering attacks. So those two together make for quite a concerning sort of situation. And we as an industry need to do more to sort of spread the word outside of just the organizations, but into the educational institution, into the schools. So how do we, I'm just looking at the time now, how do we change security cultures? There's a lot of tips and a lot of, I could talk an hour just on like some of those areas. So I've tried to focus it on just 1 or 2 tips for this talk. But please, if you have questions, I'd love to, have more conversations. So feel free to reach out. The first tip is, like with anything, especially when we talk about organizational culture or security culture, to change it or to make a dent or an improvement to it, we need to know where we are right now. So to have some sort of baseline view, and then have a goal to say, well, in the next 12 months, where would I like the organization to be? And to do that, one way one could do that is to run a so-called phishing simulation test where you can identify your user susceptibility to phishing. And we have a free one available on our website that you could you can use and test up to 100 of your users, and that would give you a baseline view in terms of how good or bad is the land of the phishing susceptibility in your organization. And then the second one, which I highly recommend, is to do a so-called security culture assessment. So those 7 dimensions that I mentioned before, you can test, by running it's like an assessment, like a survey with about 20, 25 questions. And that will give you a real in-depth baseline view in terms of how your people or how the organization is rating in each of those dimensions, whether that's policies, attitudes, norm, behavior, etc. And that is a wonderful starting point, because if you, let's say, for example, you see that there's a very low score on the policy side, that could then feed into your program for the rest of the year to improve on the knowledge of the security policies or the awareness around that. The other thing that we always talk about is, in terms of if I throw, let's say, for example, if I threw 1 ball at you, you can catch it. 2 balls, you will catch it. But if I threw 10 or 20 balls, then you wouldn't be able to catch a single one. And the same happens with people when we try to educate them or raise their awareness. If we throw too much information at them, nothing will stick. So we have to be quite selective in terms of what are we trying to, make people aware of, or what kind of behavior do we want them to change. And they often, less is better or less is more. So it's really important to focus on the key risk areas that you would like your people to improve on. And, the whole social engineering aspect is obviously one of the biggest threats in terms of, successful data breaches, etc. So from a data-driven, defense program, it makes sense to focus on social engineering, phishing, even in-person social engineering, and make your users aware of those threats. So yeah, it's better to repetitively, educate on your top risks than trying to put everything in your security policy into your awareness program, because then people won't remember. It's too much. So something that is also very interesting is another research report that we publish once a year. It's called the Phishing by Industry Benchmark Report. And what that means is when, for example, when we go into an organization for the very first time and we run that phishing susceptibility, or that we call it the fish prone percentage, then like a mock fishing simulation, the percentage value gives you the number in terms of how many people are susceptible of falling for the fish. And the average, actually globally, it's not just in Africa. I think Africa is 29.2. Globally, it's 30% hit rate, which means that when we go in the first time, 1 out of 3 people will fall for the fishing simulation. So that's quite a massive sort of threat, like a percentage value. Now, if you apply training in combination with behavior type simulation training, so fishing simulations combined with awareness training, you can reduce that threat level down by half within just 3 months. So it really drops from 30 to 15%. And within 12 months of running security awareness, according to the methods that we recommend, you can drop that way down to like a below 5% value. In fact, the average is 2%. Now that's a massive reduction in terms of risk level. And it's actually something that has been done relatively quickly in terms of, 12 months time period, and relatively simply too. So even though we talk about the human factor and it's more complex because we need to bring in the HR departments, the communications department, it's not just a technology project. It can be done relatively simply with the right tools or the right partners. So in terms of the summary, let me just check the time. So, like just to wrap up, like the need for improving our security culture is evident as per the research reports, because even the organizations that scored higher are not in the very good phase either. Like the best scorers are moderate. So we really need to do more work across the board to improve security cultures. Social engineering is one of the major threats we should be focusing on when changing people's perceptions or the security cultures. And applying the right levers in the various dimensions can show relatively quick return and quick improvements. And yes, so that is me. Thank you so much for the time. If there are any questions, let me just maybe have a look at the Q&A.
Yes. Anna, so basically there's one question is, how does one start with a security awareness or culture program? That's one of the questions.
Okay, so when you haven't rolled this out before, the first area to start off is to go to your executives or the top level management, because people look at what their leaders are doing. So it's very important to have your leaders support and get them involved, not just to, I don't know, pay for the program, but to be actively involved. And one very cost efficient way of doing that is, for example, video recording them for a minute and then have them share why cybersecurity is so important for the success of the business as well as to them personally. So that would be the first step. And then the second step would be to run a baseline assessment, as I mentioned, either the culture assessment or a phishing simulation tool to see, well, how good or bad is it really, and what goals can we set to improve things. And then it's important to identify the different audience groups in your environment and roll out different types of training or content for the audiences, because your call center people might appreciate something differently to, let's say, the finance department. And I think lastly, the most important point is to combine your training efforts with continuous phishing simulations. I mean, we, for example, internally, we get a phishing simulation once a week. So everybody in the company gets a mock phishing email every week that is different to the other people, because otherwise I would just ask, did you also get that? No, I get a randomized different phishing email every week. And that gamifies the whole behavior, because I know that once a week I will get this. I watch out every email I'm getting. I make sure I'm not falling for the phishing simulation. So it really sort of enforces or ingrains that behavior into our day-to-day lives.
Sure. Anna, also, while you were talking and giving your tech talk, there were many comments coming in from the audience. Like Jacob has said that the UFS education sector worked with the popcorn training, now known before in the past, on the awareness program and behavioral change, exceptional results. And as noted, measurement is the key.
Thank you.
All right.
That's great. Yeah.
Also, Anna, Dennis wanted to ask you about how to have an access to this survey. He's one of our attendees, and he wants to know about how does he get an access to the survey?
So the survey is available on our website. I believe we also have a booth at this conference, so you're welcome to pop in there and ask the people there to lead you to the survey, or you can DM me on LinkedIn, and then I'll send you the direct link. It's just Anna Collard on LinkedIn or on Twitter. Yeah, but it's basically available for free on our website for download, and it makes a really interesting reading because it dives into each of the industries.
Sure, absolutely. And also, Anna, Richard writes that no wonder our education systems insist on academic excellence without any cultural values that has led to the ICT gurus without any moral value in their society. So, a lot of compliments and a lot of comments came in when you spoke. So thank you so much, Anna, for your time.
Thank you so much. I hope there's a construction site next door. I hope that wasn't too distracting, but
No, absolutely. Thank you so much, Anna.